No report ever mentioned Gate 32 that afternoon. Not the delay logs, not the airline records, not the security summaries filed at shift change. Because what happened there didn't fit inside a report. It didn't look like danger. It didn't sound like a crime. It looked like nothing. And that was the problem. Because the most dangerous things in the world don't announce themselves. They move quietly in the space between what people notice and what people ignore. They live in the half second you looked away, in the detail you almost caught but didn't. Gate 32 was busy that afternoon, the kind of busy that feels loud but means nothing. Rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, the low hum of people going somewhere they'd rather not be. Coffee cups, phone screens, the mechanical sound of a world that had trained itself to stop paying attention. Nobody was watching the gate entrance. That was the first mistake, because a man walked through it, and the way he walked should have told everyone in that terminal something important. Not fast, not slow, not nervous, not alert, just present. The way water is present in a glass, contained, controlled, filling exactly the space it was meant to fill, and nothing more. He carried one bag, left shoulder. The strap sat too naturally. The weight distributed the way someone carries a bag they've carried 1,000 times without thinking. His shoes didn't squeak. His jacket didn't pull. Nothing about him snagged attention. That was intentional. Most people believe invisibility is about disappearing. It isn't. When invisibility is about fitting so perfectly into the background that the eye slides over you the way it slides over a wall you've passed every day for 10 years. You don't see the wall. You just know it's there. He knew how to be the wall. His eyes moved differently from everyone else's. Not scanning. That's too obvious, too trained, too military. More like settling, the way a photographer looks at a room before choosing the frame. Quiet, unhurried, deliberate. He noted the exits first, not because he needed to run, but because knowing where the doors are tells you where the pressure points are, where people flow, where they slow down, where they stop. Then the people, not their faces. Faces are the last thing that matter. Faces lie, bodies don't. He read the postures, the spacing between strangers. The way a man near the window kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Not impatience, something closer to guilt. The way a woman by the charging station held her phone, but never looked at the screen. Waiting, not scrolling. He cataloged all of it without stopping, without slowing, without a single visible reaction. Just a man, just a terminal. Just another afternoon going nowhere interesting. That's what the cameras would have shown, if anyone had bothered to pull the footage. A man arriving, a crowd existing, a gate doing what gates do, nothing worth reporting. But here's the thing about moments that don't make it into reports. They don't disappear. They wait. Somewhere between Gate 32 and everything that came after. A chain of events began that couldn't be undone, couldn't be explained cleanly, and couldn't be filed away under any category that made sense on paper. Because what happened next didn't start with a gunshot. It started with a hand and 4 fingers, folded quietly, then gone. His name was Kael Virelli. Not a name you'd find in a headline. Not a name attached to a business, a license, a registered address. Not the kind of name that shows up when you search. The kind of name that shows up when someone who knows better warns you. Quietly. Once, never twice. At 36, Kael had built something that most men spend their whole lives chasing without understanding what they're actually looking for. Not money. Money was a tool. Nothing more. Not respect. Respect was just fear wearing better clothes. What Kael had built was architecture. Not buildings. Not organizations. In architecture, in the way a chess player builds a position, slowly, invisibly, piece by piece, until the moment your opponent realizes they can't move without losing something, and by then, it's already too late. He had grown up in a city that didn't believe in softness, where weakness wasn't just a disadvantage, it was an invitation, where the men who survived were the ones who learned quickly that the world didn't reward feeling, it rewarded reading, reading a room, reading a person, reading the gap between what someone says and what their hands are doing when they say it. Kael had learned to read before he learned to trust. And trust, he had decided early, was a liability he couldn't afford. He had people, a network that didn't have a name because naming things makes them findable. Men who owed him silence, women who owed him more, systems he had spent years building specifically so that when something needed to happen, it happened without noise. But none of that was what made him dangerous. What made him dangerous was simpler. He noticed things, not in the way detectives notice things in films. Dramatic pauses, meaningful glances, slow motion reveals. Not like that. More like breathing. Automatic, constant. Something his mind did whether he wanted it to or not. Micro-expressions. The tiny flinch before a lie finishes forming. The way someone's breathing changes when they're performing calm rather than feeling it. The specific angle a person's shoulders drop when they've stopped believing their own story. He had never been trained formally, no academy, no program, no mentor who sat him down and mapped the science. He had been trained by consequence. Every time he missed a signal, something broke. Someone got hurt. Something he'd built cracked at a joint he hadn't inspected closely enough. So he stopped missing signals. He moved through crowds the way a surgeon moves through a body, not looking for what's there, but looking for what shouldn't be, the thing that's slightly off, the detail that doesn't match, the fracture running through the surface of normal that tells you something underneath this is wrong. That afternoon at Gate 32, he wasn't looking for anything specific. He rarely was. Searching specifically meant you could miss what you weren't searching for. So he didn't search. He just stayed open. Let the room feed him information, let the patterns settle, and then something settled that shouldn't have been there. A girl. Just young, small, moving through the crowd with the kind of careful stillness that doesn't come from personality. It comes from practice, and practice like that only comes from one place. Survival. She was 21, maybe younger if the weight she was carrying had aged her face. It does that. Certain kinds of weight. Not the kind you can put down at the end of the day. The kind that settles into the way you move, the way you breathe, the way you calculate the distance between yourself and every door in the room without realizing you're doing it. She wasn't beautiful in the way that gets noticed. She was the other kind of beautiful. The kind that stays hidden because something has taught it that being noticed is expensive. Her name would come later. What came first was the way she walked, measured, deliberate. Each step placed with just slightly more thought than walking requires. Not slow, careful. There's a difference most people never learn to see. Slow is about pace. Careful is about control. She was controlling herself. Every movement, every angle, the tilt of her chin, down but not too far. The line of her shoulders, straight but not stiff. Her hands stayed close to her sides, not tucked, not fidgeting, just present, managed. She had practiced this. The neck brace was the first thing that told the story wrong. It was pale, medical looking, clean in the way of something worn deliberately rather than recently. The foam hadn't compressed. It sat too rigid, too deliberate, the way a prop sits rather than the way a support device settles into wear. Kael clocked it in under 2 seconds. The second detail, the bruise. It's just below her left ear. Not large, not dramatic. The shape of it was wrong for an accident. Too defined on one edge, too faded on another, which meant it was older than today and newer than a week ago. Something had pressed there. Not struck, pressed. The difference matters. Striking leaves a different shape. Pressing leaves a print. His eyes moved before his face did. The way he'd trained himself, because face movement tells people where your attention is, and attention is information you don't hand out for free. She was with someone, a man, mid-40s, medium height, medium build. Nothing memorable about his face, and that was the thing about it. It was too forgettable. Features that averaged themselves into something no one would describe accurately afterward. Pale shirt, dark trousers, nor on a watch that looked expensive without trying to look expensive. His hand was on her arm, not gripping, not guiding, just resting. The way you rest your hand on something you own. She didn't look at his hand. That was the tell. When someone grabs you and you're frightened, you look at the hand. You can't help it. Your threat response pulls your eyes toward the contact. But when you've been conditioned long enough to accept the hand as a permanent fixture, you stop seeing it. She had stopped seeing it. She moved through the crowd and her eyes tracked the space ahead, managed the route, calculated angles, and never once acknowledged the hand on her arm. Because to her, the hand was just part of the landscape now. That was the most frightening thing Kael had seen all day. And then she got closer. And something else happened. Something that rewrote the entire afternoon. The most dangerous predators don't look dangerous. That's not a theory. It's a design. Kael had encountered enough of them to know that the ones who look the part, the loud ones, the aggressive ones, the ones who want to be seen as threatening, those men are manageable, predictable. They operate from ego, which means they make mistakes. They push too hard, too fast, in ways that leave marks where marks can be found. The real ones are different. The real ones have learned something that takes years and a specific kind of patience to master. That the most powerful cage you can build around a person is one they don't recognize as a cage. The man beside her had mastered it. His name at that point was still unknown to Kael. But the profile was already building in the way it always built. Quietly from the outside in, detail by detail. The watch said money, but not new money. The kind of wealth that had been present long enough to stop needing to announce itself. The shoes were clean in a way that suggested someone else cleaned them. The way he stood, weight slightly back, one shoulder marginally lower than the other, spoke of a man who was accustomed to being waited on. Not in a pampered way, in an expected way. He was used to people accommodating him, and she accommodated him the way water accommodates the shape of whatever holds it. She poured herself into the space he gave her, adjusted her pace to his without thinking, angled her body toward him when he was still, shrank her presence in proportion to his. In the whole silent performance of a person who had been systematically taught that less was safer, his face was pleasant when it moved. Not warm, pleasant. There's a difference. Warmth is involuntary. Pleasantness is a decision. His smiles arrived a half-beat after the moment that required them, which meant they were chosen, not felt. But it was his eyes that confirmed everything. His eyes never softened. Smile, nod, murmur something to her, and the eyes stayed flat, watching, calculating, registering the room not the way Kael registered it, out of vigilance, out of habit, but the way a man registers a space he intends to control. Ownership. He looked at that terminal the way landlords look at buildings. This is mine, all of it. The exits, the crowd, the girl beside me, the air between us, all of it. Kael had known men like this in contexts far darker than airports. Men who had never needed to raise a hand because they had learned earlier, more efficiently, that hands weren't necessary. That the real mechanism of control was something slower and more permanent. The erosion of a person's belief that they had options. You don't trap someone with chains. You trap them with the conviction that the chains are already there. She believed that. Every movement told him she believed it. And the man beside her was very careful, practiced, almost artistic, in making sure nothing he did in that terminal would look like anything worth remembering. He was good, but Kael was better. And then she passed him, close enough that he could hear the soft sound of her careful steps, close enough that he caught the exact moment her hand shifted. She didn't look at him, not a glance, not a flicker. Not the involuntary eye pull that happens when you're aware of someone near you. Nothing. And that, paradoxically, was what confirmed she had seen him, because people who are being watched by the wrong person learn quickly not to look. Looking invites response. Looking creates a moment, and moments in her world had consequences. So she didn't look. She passed him. 2 feet of space between them, the crowd moving around them both, the ambient noise of the terminal filling every gap, rolling bags, an announcement overhead, a child somewhere to the left asking for something repeatedly, and in the middle of all of that, her hand moved, not dramatically, not in a way that broke the surface of anything. She dropped it slightly from her side, a motion that could have been anything, adjusting the fall of her sleeve, shifting the strap of her bag, nothing worth cataloging, except 4 fingers, folded inward, held for less than a second, then released. Gone. If you had been standing exactly where Kael was standing, at exactly the right angle, you might have caught it. Might. If you knew what you were looking for. If your eyes had been trained on exactly that quadrant of movement and your brain had the specific pattern already loaded and ready to recognize. But you would have had to already know the signal, and almost no one knew the signal. Kael's feet stopped. Not visibly. His stride didn't break. His expression didn't shift. He didn't turn. Nothing about him changed in any way that could have been read from the outside. But inside, everything stopped, because what his eyes had just fed his brain didn't match the afternoon he'd been having. His brain ran it back. Automatic. The way you replay a word that didn't quite sound right. Not because you planned to, but because something in you refuses to file it under normal without checking first. 4 fingers, inward fold, brief hold, release. It wasn't a universal signal. Not something you'd find in a manual or a training document. Not something with an official designation. It was something older than that. Something passed between people in situations where there was no official manual to consult. It meant, I am not safe. I cannot say so. I need you to see this without making them see that you've seen it. It meant help. But Kael had encountered that signal exactly once before in his life. Once. In a moment that had never fully closed. In a situation that had ended in a way he still hadn't made peace with. And the person who had used it then hadn't been a stranger in an airport. She had been someone he knew. Someone he had failed. The terminal kept moving around him. The man kept walking beside her. She kept her eyes forward. And Kael stood in the middle of gate 32 with the present splitting open like old scar tissue. And something underneath it, something cold and long buried, finally beginning to move. Here is what his mind told him. It's a coincidence. You saw a gesture. Gestures look like other gestures. Well, you're pattern matching from a memory that has been sitting in the wrong part of your brain for too long. Walk to the gate, board the flight, let it go. Here is what his body did. Went still. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of something that has received a signal it cannot process fast enough to act on yet. The stillness of a system running too much at once. Because his mind was right that coincidences existed. But his body knew something his mind was trying to negotiate around. That signal wasn't common. It wasn't the kind of thing someone stumbled onto. It wasn't a gesture with cultural weight. Didn't belong to any group or movement or widely known language of distress. It had no training behind it, no online origin, no broadcast. It had been invented in pain, and pain like that doesn't replicate cleanly. And it doesn't reproduce in strangers across different years, in different airports by accident. The statistical likelihood of 2 unconnected people using the exact same signal, same 4 fingers, same specific inward fold, same brief hold, same deliberate release, was close enough to 0 that his brain kept refusing to file it there. But the alternative was worse. The alternative meant this connected to something, to someone, to a night he had spent years folding up smaller and smaller and pushing into a place inside himself where it couldn't breathe. He turned his head slowly, not toward her, toward the departure board. A natural movement. Eyes forward, face neutral. His peripheral vision did the rest. She was still walking. Same pace, same controlled posture. And the man's hand still rested on her arm with that studied casualness. They merged into the crowd near the far end of the terminal. Not disappearing, just becoming part of the visual noise. Kael noted their trajectory. Gate 19. Probably, based on the angle, or the cluster of seats before it. The kind of waiting area with just enough foot traffic to feel public. Just enough corner to feel private. He didn't follow immediately. That's what amateurs do. Amateurs react. They move on feeling on urgency, on the push of adrenaline that says now, now, now. And then they arrive without information, without leverage, without a plan, and they do damage they can't control and create noise they can't contain. Kael had made that mistake exactly once. He was 17, a different city, a different kind of danger. He had moved on instinct, without architecture, and someone had paid for it with their face against a concrete floor while he stood over them having accomplished nothing that mattered. He had never moved without architecture again. So he found a column, stood beside it naturally, pulled out his phone, not looking at it, using it as a mirror, using the glass of the screen at the right angle to track their position without turning. He gave himself 90 seconds. In 90 seconds, he would know if this was worth escalating or worth releasing. He watched. She sat down. He sat beside her. Her hands went into her lap. Her chin came down slightly. And then, so small he nearly missed it even watching directly, her shoulders moved. Not a shrug, not a shift, a deflation, the kind of exhale that means, I tried. No, nothing happened. I'm still here. 90 seconds was up. Her name had been Alara Nixon. Not the kind of name you forget. He hadn't. He had met her in a situation that had no clean way of being described, the way certain situations resist language because the language available isn't equipped to hold them without losing something important. She was 19. He was 27. They had existed in overlapping circles for less than 3 months, not romantically, not professionally, but in the way that sometimes happens between two people who recognize something in each other before they've been given the vocabulary to name it. She was careful the way he was careful, watchful the way he was watchful. But where his vigilance came from strategy, hers came from necessity. Yeah, he had understood that without her needing to explain it. The way she occupied the outer edges of rooms, the way her eyes moved towards sound before the rest of her body responded, the way she listened to silence more attentively than most people listen to words. She had learned those things the way he had learned the signal. In pain, over time. Because the alternative was worse. He had known she was in danger. Not in the vague, abstract way you sense something might go wrong eventually. In the specific, concrete, named way that meant a particular person with a particular pattern of behavior was closing distance around her in a way she couldn't see clearly because she was already inside it. He had known the name of the threat. He had known the shape of it. And he had made a calculation. It wasn't a cold calculation. That's the version he had tried to sell himself afterward. It wasn't detached. It was something more shameful than detachment. It was priority. He had something running, something built over 2 years that was at a fragile point. One wrong move, one wrong attention pulled in the wrong direction, and it would fracture. And inside that calculation, inside that architecture of consequence, he had made a decision. Not now. I'll handle it after. I'll loop back. She'll be fine until then. She had made the signal 3 days before she disappeared. Not in public, in a corridor. Quiet. She had passed him in a building they both had reason to be in, and her hand had dropped and 4 fingers had folded, and she had walked on without a word. And he had stood in that corridor and done the same thing his mind was suggesting now. Rationalized, weighed, calculated, and walked away. 3 days later, she was gone. No body, no note, no filing, no record of where she went or who had taken her, or whether she was still alive somewhere in the world, or whether the world had already closed over her, like water closes over a stone. Just silence. And Kael had carried that silence for 9 years. Not loudly, not in a way anyone would see, but it had been there. A specific weight in a specific place. The kind that doesn't interfere with function, doesn't slow you down, doesn't break anything visible, but it's there, every morning, every time something reminds you. Every time a girl in a crowded terminal drops her hand and folds 4 fingers, and your entire body locks up like a circuit that just found its ground wire. He put his phone in his pocket, stood up from the column, and walked. There is a moment. It only comes once per situation, sometimes only once per lifetime, when the version of yourself you've been building either proves itself or doesn't. There's no middle. There's no partial credit. You either move or you don't. Kael had spent 9 years in the aftermath of not moving. He knew what that felt like from the inside. The architecture of it, the way the mind builds justifications that feel like reasoning, the way each justification adds one more brick to a wall that eventually becomes a room you can't see out of. He had built that room carefully after Alara. He told himself it was practicality. That emotion has no place in the kind of world he operated in. that the people who survived were the ones who could separate the personal from the strategic, who could look at a situation and ask only, what does this cost me? Not, what does it cost them? He had been very good at believing that for a while. But there is a specific quality to certain kinds of guilt, the kind born not from cruelty but from choice, from standing at a fork in a road and choosing the branch that doesn't cost you anything. That guilt doesn't erode the way shame erodes. It doesn't fade with distance or time or the accumulation of better decisions in other areas of your life. It waits. It files everything. And when the world hands you the same fork a second time, it's not really about the girl in the terminal anymore. It's about who you find out you are. Kael had no illusions about himself. He had done things that couldn't be softened by context. He had made choices in the dark that he would never make in the light. And he had lived with that the way you live with a scar. It's there. It doesn't apologize for itself. And you don't pretend otherwise. But this specific failure, Ilara, the corridor, the four fingers, the walking away, had been different in quality from the rest. Because it hadn't been the darkness in him that had made that choice. It had been the cowardice. And cowardice is the one thing Kael Virelli had never been able to forgive in anyone, including himself. So he walked. No plan yet. Plans come from information, and he didn't have enough information yet to build anything worth building. What he had was direction, a trajectory, the specific seat in the waiting area near gate 19, where she was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes looking at nothing. He moved the way he always moved. No urgency, no tells. Just a man crossing a terminal. Just the wall again. Except the wall had decided, finally, 9 years late, that some things don't get filed away, some things get finished. He didn't go directly to her. He moved to the row of seats one position removed. Adjacent, not adjacent, adjacent. The buffer row, the row that exists inside her line of peripheral vision without being obviously close. He sat, opened his phone again. Genuinely this time, not as a mirror. But because he needed 30 seconds of normalcy to let the ambient red settle. The man beside her was speaking to her now. Low voice. The kind of low that isn't quiet because it's private. It's quiet because volume is a resource, and withholding it is one of the tools. Keeping someone in a permanent state of having to lean in, having to focus, having to work to hear you. It's a small mechanism of control, but it compounds. She was leaning slightly forward, working to hear him. He watched her nod, the nod of someone who has learned that disagreement is not free. He gave it 2 more minutes. Then the man stood, checked the departures board, said something to her, brief, definitive, and walked in the direction of the men's room or the newsstand or somewhere that required him to leave her alone for a window. And Kael was on his feet before the man had taken 4 steps. He crossed to her row, sat not beside her, but 1 seat over. The specific distance that says I am not a threat, I am not invading, but I am present and I am choosing to be present. She felt him sit down. Her posture didn't change. That was its own kind of information. A person who is okay doesn't register the proximity of a stranger with that level of control. Okay, people glance. Okay, people shift slightly, acknowledge the new presence, recalibrate. She didn't move at all, because she had trained herself to receive unwanted proximity without reaction, because reaction had a cost she'd already calculated. He looked at the departures board ahead of them both, gave her 4 seconds, then said it quietly. You're injured. Not a question, not an opener. Weighing a statement, specific, observed, directed. The kind of thing you say to someone when you want them to know you've actually been looking. Not at them, at the truth they've been packaging. She turned her head exactly as far as she needed to see him. Her eyes were dark, tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. I'm fine. 2 words. Flat. Immediate. The speed of it was the problem. Real assurance has a beat, a small gathering of the actual feeling before it arrives in language. 2 words in under a second meant the sentence had been prepared, preloaded, ready at the front of the queue for the next person who got too close. He nodded, looked back at the board, gave it exactly the right amount of time. then stood up. Because pushing was wrong. Pushing created noise, created resistance. We created a scene that would bring the man back before anything useful had been established. He had made 3 steps away when it happened. She did it again. He felt it before he saw it. The specific quality of intentional movement in his peripheral field. Not accidental, not ambient. The kind of movement that is directed at you specifically, that has a target, that is performing for an audience of exactly one. He didn't stop walking, he slowed. Just enough. And in the slowing, without turning, without making the moment visible, he caught it. The same hand, the same 4 fingers, but different this time. The first signal had been clean, controlled, professional almost. The way you signal when you've decided to try and haven't yet stopped believing it might work. This one was smaller, more compressed. The kind of signal that comes from a person who has already watched one chance dissolve into a crowd and is now using the last of something. Not hope exactly, but the specific energy that precedes a decision to stop trying. 4 fingers, inward. And then she held it 1 second longer than before. That extra second was the thing. That extra second was everything. Because it meant, I know you're about to walk away. I know this is the last time I will do this. And I need you to understand that I know you saw the first one. He stopped, turned back, and looked at her directly for the first time. Her eyes didn't waver. That was the thing that landed hardest. In someone who had been worn down the way she had been worn down, in someone who had spent enough time in the landscape of learned helplessness, you expected to see pleading. You expected wet eyes or a trembling jaw or some involuntary leak of the fear that was clearly present somewhere under the surface. She had none of that. Her eyes were dry, still, and full of a single, specific, devastating emotion. Certainty. Not the certainty of someone who believed they would be helped. The certainty of someone who had already concluded they would not be, and was watching that conclusion confirmed in real time. Kael had seen many things in his life that he would classify as difficult to look at. That look made the list. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, then walked back. Sat down beside her this time. Not 1 seat over. Beside her. Close enough that his voice would reach her and nothing further. And he said the only thing that mattered, I see you. Not I'll help you. Not you're safe. Not don't worry. Just I see you. Because she wasn't looking for a promise. She was looking to find out if she was visible. Her jaw moved once. Then she said, he comes back in 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Not a lot. Enough. Name, he said. Nova. The man with you. Cedric Holm. He books through a shell. 3 layers. 4th comes back to a holding company in Valletta. Kael looked at her. She said it the way you say a fact you've memorized in case the moment came. Not recited, precise. The way someone who has been waiting a very long time to say something out loud finally says it. How long, he said. In on her 14 months. Family? Something shifted in her face. Infinitesimal. Not anymore. He didn't ask what that meant. He noted it and moved forward. You have anything on you? Phone? He checks it. It's clean. Do you want out? She looked at him. That look again. The dry eyes, the certainty. But underneath it now, something else. Something that had been sealed off for 14 months and was feeling the air of the outside for the first time. I've wanted out since the 2nd week, she said. He nodded, stood up. Don't signal again. Don't react when he comes back. Don't look for me. You won't be visible, she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her for half a second. Neither will he. Then he walked away. And the part of him that had spent 9 years in a particular kind of silence finally went quiet for a different reason. Not suppression, not burial, movement. He pulled his phone as he walked. Not the visible phone, the other one. The one with a different number and a different architecture and a contact list that most people wouldn't survive being added to. He made 1 call, 12 seconds. Names, location, trajectory. On the other end, no questions asked. Just, timeline? Before they board, he said. Done. He hung up. By the time Cedric Holm returned from wherever he'd gone, and sat back down beside Nova with his flat eyes and his resting hand. Kael was already at a different gate, and the clock was already running. What happened next didn't happen in the airport. And it happened in 4 different cities at the same time. In a server room in Rotterdam, a name was being run. Cedric Holm, except that wasn't the full name, just the surface layer. Beneath it, 3 shell structures. Beneath those, a holding company that had been inactive since the previous year. Beneath that, a registered address attached to a property that had changed hands twice in 18 months through nominees. It took 11 minutes to get to the real name, 13 minutes to pull the full profile. Kael had people for this. Not the visible kind. Not the men who stood in rooms and made things feel heavy. The invisible kind. The kind who lived in the architecture of digital systems, the way spiders live in corners. Patient, precise, waiting for the exact thread that unravels everything. He had invested heavily in the invisible kind, because visibility has diminishing returns. Force without information is expensive. It creates noise, attracts attention, leaves evidence. But information without force is just knowledge, and knowledge sitting still doesn't protect anyone. The combination, information first, force second, precision throughout, that was the architecture. Nova's movements were being tracked without her knowing. Not intrusively, through the terminal cameras that had already been accessed in the first 3 minutes. Her gait, her seat, the distance between her and home, whether he had returned from where he'd gone, whether they were still in public or had moved somewhere with fewer witnesses. Everything fed back. Kael reviewed it without expression. Meanwhile, in a different layer, the shell company in Valletta was already being dismantled. Not loudly, quietly, the way you dismantle something when you want it gone and not just damaged. Financial records, pulled. Communications attached to the registered directors, flagged. The property linked to the 4th layer, photographed from the outside by someone who had already been in that city for other reasons. Holm didn't know his architecture was being walked through room by room. He was sitting in gate 19 with his hand on the arm of a girl he believed belonged to him, watching the departures board, managing his schedule. He had no idea that his schedule had already been changed. The flight they were on rerouted in terms of what mattered, because Kael wasn't interested in the airport anymore. He was interested in the destination. And at the destination, 3 people Kael trusted, which was a very short list, were already moving. This was the thing about architecture. By the time someone realizes a building is collapsing, the structural failure has been in progress for a long time, Holm would realize. Just not yet. The full picture came through in fragments. Kael had learned to read fragments early. Single details in isolation meant little. They needed context. They needed the frame around them, the pattern they belonged to. But once the frame emerged, once the pattern surfaced, a single additional detail could tell you everything. Cedric Holm, 43, born in a small city in Northern Europe that had no particular claim to anything. He educated at a mid-tier institution with a finance degree that appeared to have cost more than it should have. The way degrees sometimes cost more when what you're actually purchasing is the network attached to the institution rather than the knowledge. He had run 4 businesses in 12 years, all legitimate on the surface. Consulting, real estate intermediary work, an import concern that handled specialty goods. All of them had closed within 18 months of opening. All of them had been modestly profitable. All of them had involved moving money between entities in ways that required closer inspection than their paperwork invited. 3 prior complaints, 2 countries. Both complaints withdrawn before anything reached the stage of formal investigation. The withdrawals interested Kael more than the complaints. Because withdrawal doesn't mean resolution. Withdrawal means pressure. The kind of pressure that leaves no record but changes the behavior of everyone in the room. Holm was precise, patient. He didn't escalate situations. He dissolved them. He didn't create confrontations. He created conditions. Long, slow, invisible conditions that shifted the ground under a person so gradually that by the time they noticed the ground was different, they had already recalibrated to the new level. That was the signature. Not violence, not threat, erosion. And Nova, whoever she was, wherever she had come from, Not whatever had placed her in that man's orbit 14 months ago had been eroded to the point where a stranger's voice saying two words in an airport waiting area had been the first moment of genuine contact she'd experienced in over a year. "I see you." Kel had said it without calculation. It had arrived before his architecture had, which was rare. Almost everything he said passed through the filter first. Is this strategic? Is this useful? What does it open or close? That had come before the filter, which meant something had already bypassed the thing he'd built over years to prevent exactly that. He noted it without judgment, filed it, and kept working. Because sentiment, however genuine, didn't get Nova out of that terminal. And getting her out was what the afternoon was actually for. 3 hours after the airport, Kyle sat in a room that didn't have his name on the lease and reviewed everything that had been collected. Nova. Not her real name, he was almost certain. The flatness with which she'd offered it, the absence of hesitation that normally accompanies a name, genuine or otherwise, suggested she'd chosen it before the situation required it, which meant she'd anticipated the situation, which meant she'd been preparing for a moment like this. That detail had been sitting in the back of his architecture since the terminal. He went back to the signal. She had used it correctly. Not approximately, correctly. The exact four fingers, the exact fold, the exact hold. The signal, as he had encountered it before, had no formal origin. It wasn't taught, it wasn't documented, it wasn't part of any recognized language of distress. It had been created by one person, in one specific context, and passed, as far as he knew, to nobody. Yet Nova had used it, not a similar gesture, not an approximation that his memory had rounded up to recognition. The signal, precise. He had been turning this over since Gate 32, placing it at the back of everything else, allowing the operational reality of getting her safe to occupy the front. Because that was the right order. Safety first, questions after. Questions asked before safety is established create hesitation, and hesitation in those situations has a cost. But the questions hadn't stopped forming. They had only been waiting, and now, in the room with no lease and the reviewed files and the quiet, they moved to the front. How did she know the signal? There were two possibilities. The first, coincidence. The random convergence of gesture and memory that his brain had inflated into pattern. He had considered this and discarded it, as documented earlier in his own logic. The second, she had been taught it. And if she had been taught it, there was only one person who could have taught her. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called the number attached to the team at the destination. "Holm," he said, "I want him held, not moved, held." Then, "And the girl, don't approach her. Don't speak to her until I arrive." He paused. "I need to ask her something first." The house outside the city was not remarkable from the outside. That was the point. Inside, a Holm sat in a chair that had been placed specifically, distance from the door calculated, positioning relative to the light deliberate, the chair itself chosen for the way it removed certain physical options from whoever occupied it without appearing to do so. Architecture, again. Holmes' face had gone through 3 phases since he'd arrived. The first phase was composed, the face of a man who had been in unexpected situations before and had learned to perform stillness while the variables resolved. Reasonable, almost impressive. The second phase was calibration, the slight adjustment that happens when a man realizes the room he's in is not the kind of room where his usual performance has any purchase. When the people around him aren't responding to his pleasantness, aren't softened by his flatness, when aren't filling the silence with the nervous energy he was used to manipulating. The third phase was arriving now. Kyle walked in. He didn't announce himself, didn't create theater. Pulled a chair across from Holm and sat with the specific kind of ease that is more unsettling than aggression. The ease of someone who has no anxiety about this situation because the outcome is already determined, and the only question is how much discomfort precedes it. He looked at Holm for 4 seconds without speaking. Holm held the look, trained reflex, but his left hand had moved to his knee, and his index finger was pressing into the fabric in a slow, rhythmic pattern. The tell. I know what the shell companies are for, Kael said. Not raised, not cold. The conversational register. I know what the third layer points to. I know about the two complaints and who withdrew them, and what that cost them. Holmes' finger kept pressing. I also know about Nova. The finger stopped. And I know you know that what I'm about to ask you to do is the only version of tonight that ends without every one of those things becoming someone else's information. Silence. Holmes made the calculation. Kael watched him make it, saw the precise moment the scales tipped, saw the specific expression of a man who has decided that the architecture he built was not, in fact, as permanent as he'd believed. It took 4 minutes. Then Holmes talked. He talked for 40 minutes. By the end of it, he had signed what needed to be signed, confirmed what needed to be confirmed, agreed to what needed to be agreed to. When it was done, Kael stood. He pushed the chair back with the same unhurried energy with which he'd pulled it out and left the room. In the hallway, he stopped, exhaled once, then walked toward the room where Nova was waiting. She was standing when he walked in, not pacing, standing. The way someone stands when they have been managing stillness for a long time and have decided, in the private interior of themselves, that the waiting is almost done. Her posture had changed. Not entirely. The caution was still there. The economy of movement, the careful placement. But something had shifted in the degree of compression. The way a person's body subtly releases when the air pressure of a specific threat lifts. He'd seen it before. He gestured toward the chair. She sat. He sat across from her. "It's done," he said. She nodded once, and not with relief, with acknowledgement. As though done was a word she'd been waiting to hear confirmed, rather than a word that surprised her. That was the first thing. Then the second. "How did you know?" she said. He had expected the question, had been preparing a version of an answer that was true without being complete. The kind of answer that satisfies the surface of a question without opening what's underneath. But something in the way she asked it stopped him from using it. Not the words, the timing. She hadn't asked it immediately, hadn't asked it in the first exhale of released tension, the way people ask things when what they really need is to hear their own voice in a safe room. She had waited until the room settled, until the debrief feeling faded, until it was just two people. Then she asked, well, like she already knew the answer, like she was asking not to learn it, but to hear him say it. "I've seen it before," he said, carefully. Her expression changed. And that was the third thing, because the expression wasn't surprise, wasn't curiosity, wasn't the opening up that follows an unexpected piece of information. It was recognition. Old, quiet. The expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing to be said and has just heard it. "Yes," she said softly. Then she looked at him in a way that didn't belong in that room, in that context, in that version of events. She looked at him like she knew him, not from tonight, from before. And Kael, who had not been unsettled by a human being in a very long time, felt something move under the floor of everything he understood about this situation. "And where did you learn the signal?" he said. She held his gaze and answered. "You didn't help her," she said. Not a question, not an accusation, a statement, placed on the table between them with the flatness of something factual. "The way you say the window faces north, the way you say the year a building was constructed, flat, certain, not performing anything." Kael was still. The room was still. Something had just happened to the architecture of the evening. A structural shift, quiet but total. The kind where one sentence rearranges everything that came before it into a different shape. Because that wasn't information she should have had. There was no version of how she could know that. Through home, through records, through any discoverable thread that didn't require her to have access to something deeply interior. Something that lived in the private geography of a decision made in a corridor 9 years ago that had been witnessed by exactly two people. One of whom had disappeared, and one of whom was sitting across from her right now. "Who told you that?" he said. His voice hadn't changed. Volume, register, pace, identical. But she heard what was underneath it. She was perceptive enough to hear it, She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she did something he hadn't expected. She looked at him with a kind of gentleness. Not pity, not superiority, not the gentleness of someone performing empathy. The gentleness of someone who understands that the next 30 seconds are going to cost something, and who has decided the cost is worth it. She didn't want to frighten you with it, Nova said quietly. She said if she just told you, you would receive it the wrong way, that you would process it as a threat or as a manipulation, that you would build an architecture around it before you could actually feel what it meant. Kael said nothing. She knows how you think, Nova said. Present tense. Knows, not knew. The word landed in the specific place it was aimed for. Kyle's jaw was still. His hands were still. Every visible surface of him was still. But something behind his eyes had moved. She said you would hear the signal, Nova continued. And that if the man you had become was different from the man who walked away, you would act this time. And if you were the same man, she paused, then it didn't matter what happened after. The silence in the room had a texture now, heavy, specific. Kael let it sit for 10 seconds, then said one word, Ilara. Not a question, not loud, just the name, spoken aloud for the first time in 9 years, released into a room that apparently had been waiting for it. Nova said, she's alive. He didn't speak for a long time. Not processing. He was past processing. The information had arrived and the brain had received it, and the architecture had done what it always did. Began running implications, consequences, structural connections. But underneath the architecture, something else was happening that the architecture couldn't touch. Something that didn't have the vocabulary of strategy. 9 years. 9 years of a specific weight in a specific place. The weight of having made a calculation in a corridor and having paid for it in a currency that couldn't be replaced. Someone's safety, someone's freedom, the possible entirety of someone's life, against the protection of an operation that had, in the end, run its course and been filed away like all the others. The math of that transaction had never balanced. He had lived in the imbalance, had built his entire subsequent architecture in some oblique way around the structure of that imbalance. A counterweight of control and precision, and never missing a signal again that was, at its foundation, it built on a base of guilt he hadn't fully named to himself until this moment. And now, alive, not dead, not gone, not the closed narrative he had carried, the sealed story with its terrible ending that couldn't be opened or revised. Open. The story was open. He looked at Nova. Where, he said. Close, she said. She has been close for a while. How long has she been planning this? 2 years. He absorbed that. She built the scenario around Holm. Holm was already happening. She found Nova through her own network. She paused. Through me. She found me through her own network. She prepared the signal. She briefed me. She chose the airport. She chose me to be in that airport. She chose which flight you'd be on. She's known your movements for longer than that. He sat with that. On the extraordinary architecture of it. 2 years. A constructed scenario. A man she had selected because he was already in Holmes City for separate reasons. A girl briefed and prepared. A signal deployed with surgical precision in a crowd. All of it designed to produce one binary outcome. He helps or he doesn't. He is different now or he isn't. She wanted to know something, he said. It wasn't a question. He was confirming what he'd already started to understand. Nova nodded. What you would do, she said, when you saw it again. He looked at the floor, something in his face that almost no one who knew him would have recognized, because it had almost never appeared there. Vulnerability, pure, unmanaged, real. Is she here, he said. Not yet, Nova said, but she's coming. A pause. She's been waiting, Nova said, to see if she should. He stood up, walked to the window. Outside, the city existed in its ordinary way. Light and distance and the muffled arithmetic of traffic. The world going about its accountable business, indifferent to the fact that a room inside this building had just been entirely rearranged by a name and a tense. She's alive. He had built, over 9 years, an understanding of the world that accommodated her absence. That was the right word. Accommodated, not accepted, not resolved, just made room for. He had adjusted the structure of his internal geography around a fixed point of loss, the way a city adjusts its road layout around a building that cannot be demolished. Routes altered, spaces left empty, traffic redirected. Here's the shape of the loss visible in every detour built around it. And now the building was standing again, and the roots didn't know what to do. He thought about the architecture of what she had built. 2 years. 2 years of tracking him, not as surveillance, not as threat assessment, but as study, as the long, patient, careful work of trying to determine whether a person had genuinely changed or had merely become better at performing the version of themselves that was easier to live with. That was the distinction she had needed to test. Because anyone can improve their performance, the question that actually matters, and the one you cannot answer from a distance, cannot answer through observation alone, cannot answer without designing a crucible and watching someone walk into it without knowing what they're walking into, is whether the change is real. She had designed the crucible. She had placed him in it without his knowledge, and she had made the stakes the only stakes that actually mattered to him. Not his safety, not his empire, not his architecture, his character. The single irreducible question of whether the man who walked away from a corridor 9 years ago was still the man who occupied his body, or whether something had happened in the intervening years that had genuinely reorganized him at a level below performance. He turned from the window. "When she comes," he said slowly, "I don't want an introduction. I don't want a scene. I don't want theater." Nova watched him. When she comes, I want the first thing I say to her to be the thing I should have said in that corridor." He paused. "The thing I had in my mouth 9 years ago before I made the wrong decision." "What is it?" Nova asked quietly. He looked at the door. "I'm not walking away," he said. Simple. 4 words. The 4 words that had existed inside him since the corridor. The ones that had never been released. The ones that had been the architecture of everything he'd built since. The obsessive precision, the refusal to miss signals, the infrastructure of protection extended to strangers who sent 4 fingers folding in airport terminals. All of it had been those 4 words waiting for somewhere to go. And now they had somewhere. She came through the door 40 minutes later. Alara Nixon, 30 years old now. 9 years later. The 19-year-old girl from the corridor had become someone else. Not transformed in the dramatic way of fiction, but changed in the real way of survival. The change that happens when a person who has been tested in very specific ways over a very long time decides to stop being tested and start being the one who builds the test. She stopped in the doorway, looked at him. He was standing. He had been standing since Nova left the room, standing in the center of it, not near the window, not near the door, not performing readiness or composure or any of the 1,000 things he might have performed. Just standing, meeting her eyes across the room. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The room held the weight of 9 years between them, not heavy in a crushing way, but dense. So the way a long silence is dense, full rather than empty. She looked at him the way she had looked at him once before, in a corridor, when she had sent 4 fingers into the air and watched him stand there, and then watched him choose. Not quite the same look, because this time something was waiting in it. "You came back to her," Alara said. Not to the girl in the airport, not to Nova, to herself, to the moment, to the version of this that had been suspended for 9 years like a sentence waiting for its final word. And Kael said it. "I'm not walking away." The same 4 words, not loud, not dramatic, not performed for the room or the situation or the distance they'd both traveled to stand in it. Just real. Alara looked at him for a long time. "I know," she said finally. "I've been watching you for 2 years," she continued. "Every airport, every terminal, every corridor where the version of you that exists now passed someone who needed something. And you stopped. You always stopped." A pause. "I needed to know if it was real, if it was you, or if it was architecture." He understood the distinction. He had lived the distinction. "Both," he said honestly. She almost smiled. "I know that too," she said. Then she walked into the room. And for the first time since a corridor 9 years ago, they were in the same space, not as two people with unfinished business, not as a test and its subject, not as guilt and its origin. As two people who had both, in their own ways, been waiting. The girl named Nova had asked in the terminal, or across the noise of an ordinary afternoon. "How did you know?" And Kael had answered, "I've seen it before." But the complete answer, the one that could only be given here, now, in this room, with this person standing in front of him, was something quieter. He had known because some signals don't dissolve. They wait in you, patient, precise, until the moment arrives where you either prove you received them or prove you never really did. He had received it, 9 years late, but he had received it. And she, who had spent 9 years building a 2-year plan to find out, had already known he would. She had just needed him to know it too. Some people disappear so the right person will finally come looking. Ilara Nixon didn't disappear because she was taken. She disappeared to find out if she was worth being found. The answer was standing in front of her. 4 words, 9 years, one signal. That was always enough.